Today, we're in the second part of a series called Influencers, and we're talking about people who influence, not just people on social media, but people throughout history who have brought about change with their lives and with what they believe. So here's kind of the idea behind the series, and if you weren't with us last week, this might fill you in a little bit. When I was growing up, I remember being really young, like first or second grade, people would come up to me pretty frequently, especially when I was new, and they'd ask, like, what are you? And that, you can answer that question a lot of different ways, you know? But pretty much, most of the people in our little circles at school, they knew what that meant. It meant, like, what's your nationality? What's your religion? Who comes down your chimney? What do you celebrate in December, right? That whole thing. And so you'd say whatever you are. You might say, oh, I'm, Dutch, I'm Haitian, I'm Irish, Norwegian, whatever. For me, I would say I'm Irish and Italian, and I'm, Christian, or depending on my season of life, I might have said, oh, I'm Catholic, or whatever. But there's like a few things you kind of list off. Though around here, a lot of people like to throw in Italian, even if they're not. Anyway, but I'm biased. But for me, that was my, in the religion column, I had something to say. It meant that I celebrated this holiday and that holiday and not this one, right? And for a lot of people, that's kind of where it ends. It determines what I think about certain things. It determines what I do at certain times of the year. But it really doesn't make all that much of a difference in my life, except maybe for things that I value, right? In the process of, the development of my faith, there came a point where I started asking questions on my own. And during that season of life, I started reading biographies or watching documentaries about people who believed this stuff. Not people who are in the Bible, though reading about them is great, but people who more recently took these same ideas and plugged them in. And what caught me off guard was just how radically it changed their lives. And the crazy amount of influence they had because of what they believed. And all of a sudden, what I believed became this thing. Rather than just an item in my Facebook description, it was now something that to me was all this potential for what life could be. And the hope for this series is that even in just talking about some of these things, you'll see, if you haven't before, really the difference that can be made in your life and in the lives of others by you believing these things and plugging them in to your own life, or at least considering it if you're not there yet. And so last week we talked about this guy. His name was William Wilberforce. And he was extremely influential, but it's relatively he's not all that famous considering what he accomplished. He was born in England, and he's the one who ultimately is responsible for the slave trade being abolished. And eventually, slavery was outlawed because of him in England, because of his initiatives. It was a 40-something year-long battle. And at the time, he was the only one fighting it, or initially. And eventually, that changed the whole world. But the thing that caused him to go after that was a change in what he believed. He really wanted nothing to do with God or church. He thought it was crazy and for uneducated people, but there came a point where he came to believe, and then his question was, well, now what? And his initial decision was to go work in a church somewhere, go be a pastor or a monk, or just cut yourself off from society and go be spiritual alone. But one of his mentors pulled him aside and was like, no, don't throw away all the success you have, all the influence you've earned, your platform. At the time, he was very successful politically. He's like, use that for something good. And because he changed the way he understood his current circumstances, he literally changed the world. The question he asked, and the question that I challenged you to ask, or at least think about, was this: what if you are the way you are, in the place you are, right now, at the time you are, for a reason, for such a time as this? Just thinking that way can change the way you live your life. And so that was last week. Today, there's someone else we're going to talk about. And again, I'm gonna just leave you with a question to ask, something to think about. But like last week, I'm not gonna tell you what the question is just yet. First, I'll tell you who we're talking about. This week, we're talking about a woman named Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom was around during World War II. She was born in 1892, and she passed away in 1983. And she was raised in a Christian home. Her father was a watchmaker. He literally made watches, and she was part of that family business. Everyone in that family was part of that family business. And the faith of that family was really influential. Like, the father was known as someone who just cared about people. He was an example to the people in his community. Corrie had a sister named Betsy. And according to Corrie, Betsy was like the spiritual sister. She struggled a little bit, but Betsy was the one that was always leading the way spiritually. And so this family just became known for being open-handed and generous and genuinely caring. And so it caused them to do all sorts of amazing things. You can YouTube Corrie ten Boom's story. It's hard to, like, the list of things she's done just goes on and on and on and on and on. But she did things like caring for kids with disabilities. She opened up her home. She just looked out for people that a lot of other people didn't look out for. And then there came a point in her life where the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, which is where she lived. And she can remember hearing planes fly overhead. And so her spiritual sister pulls her aside, and they start to pray as a family. And the sister prays for their family. She prays for comfort. She prays for peace. And then she prays for the Nazis. And Corrie steps back and is like, why are you praying for the Nazis? The brokenness within the Nazis. And her sister said, well, Jesus told us to pray for our enemies. And things like this all along her life really challenged her. And eventually, they started seeing Jewish members of their community disappear. And no one was exactly sure why, but as time passed, they started to realize they were probably in danger. And so they opened up their home. Their house was built in a really awkward way, and there just happened to be this gap in between two of the walls. Corrie talks about that gap as being providential. But at the time, it was just a weird architectural thing. They had someone come in, they built a bookcase, and eventually they turned that little gap in between the wall into a hiding place. And this Christian family opened up their home to Jewish people seeking refuge, trying to avoid being taken away. It's estimated that during this time, they hid up to 800 people, saved the lives of up to 800 people, simply because they were looking out for them. What they were doing was illegal, it was risky, but they cared. And so Corrie led this charge with her family. It was hard for them to figure out who could be trusted and who couldn't be trusted, and they were constantly trying to navigate that. But one day, they asked someone for help that they thought could be trusted, but they were wrong. And not long after that, their house was raided. And they hid those seeking refuge in the hiding place to keep them safe, and they were kept safe. But the members of the family were arrested, and Corrie was arrested. She was put into solitary confinement for a while, and eventually, after that, she was shipped off to a concentration camp. All because she was hiding Jewish members of her community, people seeking refuge. She happened to be reunited with her sister, Betsy, at that concentration camp, and there Betsy continued to challenge her. In their barracks, Betsy would have these little prayer meetings every night, which was not okay. It was not allowed, but they would do it anyway, and they never seemed to get caught. And she would pray, and they would pray for all the ladies there, and they would join them, and they became this source of comfort for the people there. And Corrie can remember one night Betsy praying and thanking God for all the things around her. And at one point, she thanked God for the fleas that had infested their barracks. And again, Corrie steps back. He's like, no. Why would you thank God for the fleas? And her sister says, well, because God told us to be thankful in all circumstances. So I'm thankful. I'm going to thank him for these fleas, which is interesting. I don't know that I would have done that, but she does. They later found out that they were able to do so much of what they did in those barracks because none of the guards would enter their barracks because they were infested with fleas. And so they were saved from all this abuse. They were able to do things a little bit differently in there, but still they were subject to things like starvation, to terrible conditions. They were jammed, hundreds of them, jammed into these crowded barracks. There was disease. It was horrible. Abuse, starvation, terrible. And all the while, Betsy would sit there and pray for the Nazis. And Corrie was constantly challenged by this. Even through that, Betsy is trying to find the ability to forgive these Nazis. Eventually, she shared with her sister that she hoped that one day these concentration camps would be painted green and used to be a place of restoration for people who were part of the Nazi party while she's being abused. Eventually, both of them get out of the concentration camp. For Betsy, it's because she passed away. She died there, and that was the end of her time there. But for Corrie, there was a clerical error. She was called into an office. They asked her some questions, had her sign a piece of paper, and then they let her go. She found out a week later that the women from her barracks who were that age were all sent to the gas chamber a week later. And somehow, because there was an error, she was released. And from there, now with her sister gone, she was constantly challenged to forgive those in the Nazi party, to forgive the people that did this to her. And eventually she did. Eventually, after the war, she took those concentration camps and painted them green and made a place of restoration for former members of the Nazi party. And she began to travel around teaching people the power, the liberating power of forgiveness, forgiving your enemies. And it was amazing. She had a tremendous amount of influence because of the way she was able to live in spite of her circumstances. And then one day she's speaking, and at the end of her message all about forgiveness, somebody comes up to her. And this guy says, I'm so glad you've talked about forgiveness. Forgiveness for me, he said, I've come to believe that Jesus has forgiven me, and I've needed that so badly because I was a member of the Nazi party. He said, I was a guard in the concentration camp. And he said, I know God has forgiven me, but now I'm seeking the forgiveness of the people that I've hurt. And so, knowing your story, he reaches out his hand and he says, will you forgive me? And she looked at him and she knew exactly who he was because he was a guard in her concentration camp. And he didn't recognize her, but she recognized him. And day after day, this man would mock her as she and her sister would shower. He made her life miserable, her existence miserable. And he didn't know that she was one of the women that he was doing that to every single day. But he stood there with his hand held out, asking for forgiveness. And she said, when he asked internally, her response was no. There's no way. All the emotions she had from that whole experience came back in that moment. But she said, in that moment, I remembered how the Apostle Paul had written that God's love had been poured out in our hearts. And she said, so I just asked God there, will you love this person because I can't? And then she made the choice to put out her hand, even though she felt none of it, and she shook it. And you have to hear her describe what the experience was like. She said the moment I shook his hand, it was like it was like God through me was forgiving this person. And there I learned to rely on God to do things I could not do on my own because I cannot forgive him. And so this story like radically changed lives and still is changing lives. She's passed away now. But her story of forgiveness changes lives. Now, I heard that, and I'm reading, and I'm listening, and I'm researching Corrie ten Boom. You really should do it yourself. Her story is like, I've just scratched the surface. But the question that like kept rising to the surface for me was like very simply, why? And would I do that? Why would you open up your home to hide all these people? What's in it for you? What do you have to gain? Why not just like pray for them? Or tell them you're thinking about them? Or be extra nice to those people you know who are in danger? Because that's probably what I would have done. Why? Why would you do that? Why would you try internally to pray for the people who are attacking and threatening your safety? Why would you thank God for fleas? Why would you try to comfort people in your barracks? Like, what's in it for you? And why, when it's all over, man, like just go retire and go live on an island and have pina coladas by the pool every day for the rest of your life because you earned it. But why then spend the rest of your life trying to help these people heal and spread this message of forgiveness? Why? What's in it? What's in it for her? And the answer, very simply, is nothing. In the moment, every time she was forced to make a decision, the immediate benefit was not clear. You know, we talk a lot about practical things around here. And whenever we're talking about certain subjects or certain passages in scriptures, we work hard, like I work hard to try and show you this is how this makes a difference in your life. This is how it ends up being a benefit, a help to you. Like we really emphasize the practical side of things because that matters. But this is a hard one because there's nothing in it for her. In those moments, when if she were filtering her decisions through what's in it for me, she would have made none of those decisions. And we wouldn't be talking about her today. Now, let me be clear. Looking back, there was a lot in it for her. One, she didn't carry the weight of unforgiveness. She didn't have to live with anger and bitterness. We're talking about her. Books have been written about her. She's influenced millions of people. There was a lot in it for her looking back. But in those moments, none of those benefits were clear. It's a level of faith, of trust in God, of doing what he says, even when you don't know what good can come from it. Even when it appears that there's nothing in it for you. And so the question that came back to me over and over and over again, not this nicely polished and it didn't rhyme, but the question essentially that I was forced to ask myself time and time again is, what do you do when nothing's in it for you? And there's so much clarity just in asking yourself that question. I'm not even saying do something when there's nothing in it for you. I'm just saying typically, how often are you relying on the what's in it for me filter? Because if we're being honest, it's the natural thing to do. To assess the situation, be like, okay, what do I have to gain from this? I'll help them, but maybe there's a good relationship here that will somehow benefit me in the future. And it's we're looking for win-win opportunities. What do I have to gain here? But nothing she accomplished would have been accomplished if she was using that filter. And the challenge of her life here is simply to ask, what do you tend to do when nothing's in it for you? And we can forget about putting your life on the line, like and hiding people who are in trouble. What about when it's simply like an argument and you've got the opportunity to right the wrong? And you can say, look, I have to own this. but there's nothing really obviously in it for you. What do you do? Or maybe you screw up and someone else is paying for it and you're watching it and the thing's just gonna carry out on its own. It probably won't come back to you. You're probably good. There's really nothing in it for you if you step up and say, that was me, not them. What do you do when there's nothing in it for you? Because if you're like most people, if you're like me, the natural thing to do is just like, well, there's nothing in that for me. Jesus talked about it like this. He said, you have heard it said, and he's speaking to the religious community, okay? This is important. He's speaking to people who are theoretically on board with what he teaches. He says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, don't resist an evil person. Don't try to get away from someone just because they're not looking out for your good. He says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Turn the other cheek. That came from Jesus. He goes, and if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, well, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. That's the extra mile. It's another thing that came from Jesus. A lot of people don't know that. Give to the one who asks you. And don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He's talking to a group of people who have bought into what he teaches. He's not saying like be a doormat. He's not saying let people take advantage of you. He's not saying be a mush that just gets slapped around like crazy. He's trying to teach them to think, like remove the what's in it for me filter. Remove that. Learn to think of the good of other people in spite of how it might affect you personally. And Jesus actually gives us a reason here. He gives these people a reason. And here's his reason. He says, then you may be children of your Father in heaven, who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. He's not saying if you do this, like you earn a place in God's family. He's saying, like, live like your dad. If you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, if you buy into this, if you believe, like, live like God does. And I think the most important thing we can take away from this passage here, honestly, I think the main point here is the whole idea of turn the other cheek, the extra mile, the giving to the one who, like, beyond that whole thing. What Jesus is saying here is, this is what God is like. That's the point. You have a God who gives to the one who acts and to the one who doesn't. You have a Father in heaven who turns the other cheek, who's going the extra mile, who's radically generous, super concerned about people, and operates not with the what's in it for me filter. He's saying that's what that looks like. And if you're someone who doesn't believe in the whole Jesus thing, or you're not sure about God, or if to you God is some angry, power-hungry, rule-giving dictator, the most important takeaway for you is not to do anything. It's simply to hear Jesus say, if you're not sure about God, this is what he's like. And from there, if you start to believe that, the invitation is to live like your Father in heaven. Live in a way that resembles him. Don't operate with the what's in it for me filter, because he doesn't. The life of Corrie ten Boom, for me, maybe it's different for you, but it hits me like between the eyes with this question. What do you do? What do you do when nothing's in it for you? At home, at work, with your plans, with your dreams, with your friends? What do you do? What do you do when you're not going to get credit? What do you do when nobody's going to notice? I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. We're going to wrap things up. But like part of this teaching, Jesus does it a little bit here, but does it also in other areas of Scripture. He's painting a picture, almost like casting a vision of what the future could look like. Again, he's speaking to his followers. And it's as if, like over and over and over again, he presents this idea. Could you imagine what a community of people who live like that could do in this world? Like we talked about one person, Corrie and her family, so a few people, who were willing to act even when there was nothing in it for them. People who are willing to remove the what's in it for me filter. But Jesus constantly was suggesting, like, could you imagine if there were a group of people who were known for living that way? Can you imagine the lives that they could change? Can you imagine the reputation these kinds of people would have? Could you imagine the impact, the influence that could have on a community if people came together and did that? If you've gotten, I'll tell you right now, which is something I find pretty cool. 2,000 years later, if you have gotten anything good out of community church, it's because people have been asking that question. It's because when people hear the parking lot's torn up and there's a gigantic puddle and we got no spots and the dirt's loose, there are people that come early and stay longer because they're like, let's go. We've got people here to serve, not asking what's in it for me. So today I'll leave home my white Nikes. You have people that give above and beyond and don't care about who gets the credit. You have people who are willing to go the extra mile, who give not just their shirt but their coat. And it's amazing to see the lives that are changed because of it. And so what if we can do that? Especially if you consider yourself someone who's part of this church. Can you imagine here in this community if we were just known as people that just cared? That weren't always out for ourselves, but were willing to act even when there was nothing in it for us? Can you imagine the change, the influence we'd have here if we decided that we would live like our Father in heaven?